Hi everyone. Hi everyone, a very good day. My name is Ruth Lee, the Associate Director of Global External Affairs, responsible for the public policy and regulatory affairs for USP APAC region. We are delighted that you can join us in this virtual site session at the Prince Mahidol Awards Conference, PMAC for short, 2022. Well, through our distinguished speakers and panelist members, the session hopes to bring about a lively discussion and views, highlighting critical considerations that are needed or necessary for preparing NMRAs to address future pandemics by establishing appropriate and agile drug approval processes. Now, before I move on to the agenda proper, which is rather packed, I must say, allow me to quickly draw your attention to a few housekeeping rules. If you need any technical assistance, please direct your message to the USP support via the chat box. Now, feel free to submit questions at any time during the meeting into the Q&A window. Okay, you may access the Q&A by selecting the Q&A icon along the bottom of the screen. All questions will be addressed during the Q&A session only. Do not use the chat panel for question submission. As you know, you'll be muted during the presentation session, and a gentle reminder for the speakers and presenters, please keep to your allocated time. Now, this meeting is being recorded. Recordings will be published via the PMAC site meeting page. Now, today's agenda, as you can see, is we will have a welcome remark by Mr. Drew Okiki, followed by a presentation by the PQM class technical team. And then we will have a very exciting panel discussion talking about reflection on current challenges and way forward. And this one will end with a Q&A session and a closing remarks, as well as follow-up actions. So to begin the session, we are pleased to introduce Mr. Jude Mukiki, Vice President, USP, Director of PQM Plus Program, who will be giving us the welcome remarks. Jude is a pharmacist by training, with postgrad degrees in pharmaceutical sciences and public health. He has served on international expert advisory and review committees, professional scientific associations, and international technical working groups. He comes with a wealth of experience of more than 2 decades, especially in the area of strengthening medical products regulation and quality assurance systems. Over to you, Jude.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, and I hope everyone can hear me. Really many thanks to all of you for joining us today. It is with a great pleasure that I welcome you all to this PMAC 2022 side meeting that is hosted by the Promoting the Quality of Medicines Plus program, implemented by the United States Agency for International Development. Today's session is really a very exciting one. The topic is on preparing national agencies, regulatory agencies for future emerging disease pandemics, a risk-based approach on emergencies, authorizations, and approvals. As most people working in the pharmaceutical sector have come to realize, the current COVID-19 pandemic has exposed several inadequacies in regulatory pathways that are used for ensuring timely access to medical products during health emergencies. And those inadequacies are not really new. They manifested previously during the avian influenza, during MERS, during SARS, during Ebola. But I think what has happened with COVID-19 is that it's brought it into a very great focus. It's brought it into focus, and most people are now increasingly aware of things like emergency use authorization. This is a topic that most people never knew what it really meant, except for the experts. But now, the general public understands it, and they're really very, very pushful and supportive in really finding ways that promising medical products can be brought to the market very quickly. So ideally, all medical products regulatory agencies should have adequate policies, regulatory frameworks, relevant laws, guidelines, procedures, processes. All those tools that are relevant should be in place so that during health emergency, you can quickly get promising products to be in use. right? These should include risk-based assessments, way to conduct risk-based assessments. And so in the session today, we really go deep into thinking about emergency use authorization as one aspect of that facilitated regulatory pathways or risk-based assessments. And we are going to have learnings that are coming out of the tools that are currently being deployed, as well as anticipation of what future health emergencies will be like and what practitioners need to have in place to confront that. Those tools will have to include reliance. They will have to include recognition. Um, Health emergencies are not time for duplicative reviews. They will be a disservice, and people could die when access to promising products are not made available. So these are the reasons that made it very, very important for us to discuss this topic today. So in conclusion, I really like to thank the speakers and panelists that we have assembled today that are very ready to share their extensive experiences on this topic. I will really want to urge each and every one of us to follow this session closely. Um, be ready to participate in the discussion when question and answer time is provided. But most importantly, to reflect on what this means when you just oppose it to what you've experienced during COVID-19 pandemic. What does it mean in terms of timely access to vaccines, in terms of timely access to preventives, and in terms of timely access to COVID-19 therapeutics? And some of them are still also coming out. Recently, we all are aware of molnupiravir as well as Paxlovid, both products that have received EUA from US FDA, and maybe other regulatory authorities in mature markets are also evaluating those products for possible EUAs. And low and middle income countries have to take a decision. Now, those decisions do not have to require de novo review, right? So we are hopeful that those decisions will have to build some elements of reliance, some elements of recognition, or some elements of working together with WHO through the emergency use listing system that WHO have in place. So I want to thank the panelists and the speakers today. I really urge all of us to stay connected with this topic and then follow the session closely. Thank you very much. And back to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Jude, for gracing the event and for setting the stage for the discussion later on. Okay, next, I'm pleased to introduce to you three speakers from PQN Plus technical team who will be presenting on the topic of preparing national medicines regulatory authorities for future emerging disease pandemics, a risk-based approach on emergency authorization of drug approvals. Now, the team comprised of Dr. Suli Panawang, Senior Technical Advisor, Regulatory System Strengthening for Global PQN Plus program. We also have Mr. Sultan Ghani, who is also a Senior Technical Advisor, but he's for the Asia Region PQN Plus program. And last but not least, we have Mr. Gabriel Kadu, who is our Technical Advisor for the Regulatory System Strengthening for Global PQN Plus program. So I'd like to welcome the three speakers to take over. Over to you, Dr. Suli and team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for the introduction. So I will take the first crack among the team members from the technical team. As you may have already learned from you, the Vice President and the Director of the PQM Plus program. So just briefly about the background about the need for this kind of conference that we are gathering now. Just really come together and then what experience that we can share, what lesson we can learn from the past pandemics or outbreaks, including avian influenza or bird flu, SARS, Ebola, and MERS, etc., and specifically with the COVID-19 pandemic that all of us are facing. So keeping in mind that if the availability of the vaccines, therapeutics, and medical devices, including the IVDs, are not immediately available to save life, then the consequences can be catastrophic. That's why it's timely for us to come together and share our lessons together. Next slide, please. I am talking about the context on the next slide is really when we have theoretical aspect of the pandemic, how the pathway should look like. In practice, it would be more I would say critical in terms of putting the guidance document, the law, the regulations, SOPs into practice. And we will share with you some of the experience that PQM Plus have been doing in the past 2 years or so during the pandemic COVID-19, so that we can look into that and what lesson we can learn, and we can discuss the path going forward. Next slide, please. Specifically, we would like to see the different pathway in terms of the framework here suggested for the vaccine. As you can see here, do we need to have a full review? Probably not in the case of emergency we are facing, for public health perspective. And looking from the fast track review, basic documentation purpose, for example, do we have sufficient data on the quality? We don't need to wait for that. Safety, efficacy, and performance of the product? Probably yes, as long as we have some information to inform our decision for authorization in emergency use, then let's go for that. And the principle of reliance and recognition is part of the consideration along the way for 3 product lines: vaccine, therapeutics, and medical devices, including IVD. Next slide, please. So if you look into the y-axis here, improving efficiency, and the x-axis building the trust between the NMRAs, you can see on the left-hand side, if we follow the standard procedures, it would take a lot of time and the independent decision-making by each of the regulatory authority. But as we move up with the working, sharing the bridge pathway using reliance, so we can save a lot of workload there, relying on the reference regulatory authority, for example. And on the top of the line there, when you reach the recognition based on the treaties, the MOUs or whatever arrangement that the 2 organization or authority or multiple at the regional level, then it would serve better and produce more efficiency in the way that we assess and authorize the product to be available in the market. Next slide, please. So this is one of the slides that I like very much in terms of the specificity of the activities that need to build in the 3 phases in terms of the EUA process. You can see pre-emergency phase, you have the agreement within the NMRAs, the roster of the experts, eligibility of the products that would be also discussed during the panel discussion. Consensus on the requirement, assignment, and assessment pathway, including the establishment of the ad hoc committee, assessments submission based on the applications that come to you. But once the emergency phase hits, then the addition to it is just ad hoc committee to inform the decision to the regulators to authorize or not to authorize. And of course, once the product already in the AUA phase, then post-deployment phase, you need to consider to add the post-marketing surveillance, safety surveillance on the adverse events. We can look into that in the next slide. Next slide, please. Here, I just would like to bring to everyone's attention, looking from the stringent regulatory authority standpoint, for example, US FDA and also European Medicines Agency. On this slide, you can see the FDA. The emphasis is to facilitate the availability and use of medical countermeasures, including vaccines, during the public health emergency, meaning authorize the unapproved product or unapproved for use, for that specific for use in the emergency situation. Next, please. So if you look in the European Medicines Agency, then you can see the emphasis is conditional marketing authorization. It does not mean that you need to have a comprehensive clinical data than normally used or in the full review, for example. So the emphasis also here is seriously debilitating or life-threatening disease in the public health emergency. Next slide, please. So if we look at the World Health Organization, the emphasis also here is using the risk-based assessment of the quality of the safety, efficacy, and the performance of the product. So based on the public health emergency, so you need to see the following criteria to be listed under the World Health Organization emergency use listing. Previously, it was known as WHO Emergency Use Assessing and Listing, EUAL, now is EUL. So the criteria include the product intended for immediate life-threatening and has potential, ability to cope with the outbreak, the pandemic, or the epidemic. So the second is quite critical. Existing products have not been successfully used, or they are not able to cope with the pandemic situation. That's why, it's important to have inclusion of this criterion in there. The product is manufactured within the compliance of the current GMP for the medicines and the vaccine. But for the IVDs and medical products, the key consideration is the quality management system. And the last criterion is the applicants has to commit to further develop and provide the data to verify the quality, safety, and efficacy of the product. Next slide, please. Now, we look into the examples of the guidance on EUA. You can see different countries using different language in terms of the title of the act or the guidelines. So we don't need to go through this, but we even share with you the slide so that you can take a look and see what is the title of the EUA guidance document in your country, if any. Next slide, please. If we look into the PQM plus assistance in the past 2 years period, you can see the way that we try to help is streamlining the review process in the point 1. For example, implementing the different regulatory agility of the regulations pertinent to the adaptation, revising the existing guidance document, for example. And the second sub-bullet is really practical. To ease the medical product applications, the authority is advocated or encouraged to create 2 or multiple channels for receiving the application, a separate line for the emergency use applications, so that we don't jam the review or receiving the application with the other use ordinary applications. And the second, collaborate for the development directive guideline to facilitate the importation and donation. Some countries have been struggling with the COVAX donated vaccine initiative, for example. But when PQM Plus jump in, this is what you should consider to do it, then the process has been streamlined. And the third introduced the risk-based approach for post-marketing surveillance on the vaccine and related COVID-19 products, including remdesivir and others, PPE, for example, for the medical devices. And the fourth is introduce safety surveillance for adverse event following the immunization, and also for the special interest to make sure that the safety of the product is coming in, fit in, whether there's necessary changes in the course of the clinical introduction of the product, or to put on hold or suspend or revoke from the EUA status. And the last is improving or accessing and making sure that the authority are capacitated for the lot release functions. Next slide, please. So these are the list of the countries that have been supported by PQM+. You can see Asia region. These are the names, as you can see, starting from Bangladesh to Uzbekistan. On the product lines also described there. In Africa, there's more countries there, but the majority of them are involved in vaccine. Next slide, please. So move on to this. I will hand over to my colleague, Gabriel. If you are there, please take over on this. So these are the examples of the PQM+ developed guidance document that can be adopted and adapted by low and middle income countries to speed up the access to medical product in emergency use. Gabriel?
Thank you, Suli. So the PQM+ program, working together with our technical partners, University of Washington and the Global Impact Health Group, undertook a number of activities, and these included conducting a desktop research to better understand the practices by the stringent regulatory authorities and WHO. We also conducted an assessment in 16 PQM+ countries for EUA readiness, and also developed the guidance based on the findings. So this guidance has been designed to provide a practical instruction to the national regulatory authorities on adopting, implementing, and managing the expedited approval pathways for vaccines, with a focus on the EUA for COVID-19 vaccines, but noting that the same principles could be used for any other medical products. It was based on the rapid assessment of the COVID-19 vaccine approval processes in the 17 countries, and it emphasizes the importance and provides considerations and examples for the different approaches that can be used. In some countries, they already had some mechanism, but needed to be improved for efficiency. And in others, they did not have this mechanism. And also to note that a number of the countries needed to have a better understanding of what emergency use authorization is. As Suli indicated, it is a conditional approval, and the companies are still expected to submit the full information to be able to have the products fully registered in the country. This guidance also does provide or include recommendations for developing communication plans and products to facilitate transparent communication with the public. We all know the importance of communication and gaining public confidence in these products that are needed to address the public health emergency. We have also been able to include practical considerations for strengthening the operational policies and the procedures, and also being able to have or establish clear review timelines or allow for rolling submissions using a standardized application forms and checklists, and also recommend investing in regulatory information systems. So this guidance was meant to be practical and make it easy for these countries to adopt and based on the laws in their country, and be able to implement an efficient system and make timely availability of these medical products. The next slide. So the second guidance document was specifically on the diagnostics. We all know that several countries, from the research conducted, we noted that about 50% of the countries were not regulating the medical devices. But we do know the importance of ensuring that these diagnostics are able to do what they expected to do in identifying the diseases of the virus. We all are aware that the epidemics of infectious diseases are increasing in frequency and severity. The current one, the COVID, we have seen how there are different mutations, different types coming up. So we have to have systems in place to ensure that we have appropriate diagnostics to identify and inform the interventions. So this guidance is to provide the practical instruction to the NRAs on adopting and implementing and managing the expedited approval pathways for the diagnostics. However, we also noted that there is need to rely on the work that has already been done by the other countries, learn from the best practices and be able to adopt. And as indicated by Jude and by Suli, reliance is key. So this will avoid the need to have to redo what work has already been done. The next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, so lastly, this slide is to talk about what work we have done in one of the PQM countries, that's Uzbekistan. And this was supported by funding from the USAID. So we had to explain and sensitize the National Regulatory Authority staff about the emergency use authorization so they could have a better understanding and be able to effectively implement it in their country. And as a result of this, the Ministry of Health has come up with a proposal in the regulatory document, that's the regulation for registration, and has included the emergency use authorization. So once this is approved, we shall go ahead to work with the authority to put in place an efficient system for handling any medical products that are required for public health emergencies. Next slide. Oh, so let me hand over to my colleague Sultan to take over from here. Thank you. Sultan.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Let's look at what lesson we learned from the COVID-19, and that will definitely help us in designing and getting ourselves ready for the future if there are any future pandemic. So we need an extensive coordination is essential, and keep the information and our understanding, make sure that our understanding is very clear and what is happening. We also, it's very important to ensure that the clinical course of the disease, and if there are some adjustments of the diagnosis and the treatment and any additional prevention besides whatever we are doing it at this time. So the next is we develop and implement the potential reliance and recognition. And these are the two important things, and those measure that how we can make sure that our evaluation of the availability of medical product are efficient, effective, and we have to ensure that they are safe and they are effective and the product are of quality. So that is another important thing that we have to learn from this exercise. Closely monitor the virus trajectory and how the virus is moving, how the virus is affecting, and what intervention we needed for that. And the last is we exchange the efficient and rapid information among all our key stakeholders. Next slide, please. So what are the possible ways to strengthening NMRAs for the preparedness or the future pandemic outbreak? And that's quite important that all these countries must be ready and what they have learned at this COVID-19 may not be repeated again if there are any issues. So establishing and developing and coordinating the comprehensive preparedness program. Though there are many countries that do not have that program, and either in form of a regulation, in form of a framework, in form of a policy, etc. And then at the same time, we should scan the horizon for the major threats to health and the potential countermeasures that we have to take it and to ensure that we are ready to face this challenge. Funding and research and development is important and it's necessary. We make sure that there is supporting manufacturing capacities because that is one of the issues that we have noticed, that the availability of the vaccines in case of the COVID-19 for many countries. So that lesson that we have learned is to ensure that the manufacturing capacity is there, and then ensure that these stockpiling and the essential medicine supply and equipment are also very important. So these are the possible ways that the NMRAs get themselves prepared for the future pandemics and any other outbreak. Next slide, please. So what's the take-home messages? We have make sure that most important is the principle of reliance and recognition. That is very important factor for the immediate availability in case of these emergencies. And the next important point is that the MRA preparedness for the future EIPD, which is the immediate availability of the product, and that is very early intervention. We can do it in the development profile. That is quite important. That how we do this intervention and get ourselves prepared for any of the issues that we have to face it, or these countries have to face it, and emphasize on the emergency use authorization. This is even some problem recently, even the new oral product that has been developed, that the different countries have a different timelines for the approval. And the reason for that is that they are not prepared, they are not ready for that, or they are lacking the review processes, not in line how to do it, and use the risk-based evaluation because of the limited data they have it. So many NMRA country, they do not have the appropriate policies. They require either the regulatory framework or some, at the same time, the knowledge to effectively deploy the EUA as a tool to expedite the availability and the accessibility of the product in the public health emergency situation. And they do need definitely some technical assistance, because with the limited data that available on these product, we have to ensure by using risk management and make sure that those principles or those tools of the risk management has been properly applied. So I think this is the take-home messages that are important. And I think that is our last slide. I again thank Soli and Gabriel and myself in this presentation. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Soli, Gabriel, and Sultan for setting the context of the conversation, sharing the experience from the countries, but also highlighting the policy and regulatory challenges across the emergency use authorization process globally. My name is Dr. Chaitanya Koduri. I'm the Director for International Government and Regulatory Engagement for US Pharmacopeial, and I am very happy to moderate the panel discussion today. We have really good a panel of senior regulatory authorities and policy experts from our partner organizations. In the conversation today, to continue what my colleagues from PQM have started, we're going to talk about the real life experience where some of the drug regulatory authorities have implemented these principles, but also hear firsthand from our policy experts on how the challenges and policy insights of emergency use authorization have been implemented. We'll have 30 minutes of conversation where we will talk about their experiences, but also have some time for question answers from the participants. So if you have any questions, feel free to chat in the question answer box. So with that, I'll start by introducing our panel today and then move into the question answer session. We'll start with Dr. Obaidullah. So Dr. Obaidullah is the Director for Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan. Then we have Dr. Ben Colin. He's a Senior Health Specialist with the Health Sector Group at the Asian Developmental Bank. We then have Dr. Jean-Jacques Fair. He's a Senior Health Governance Advisor in the Asian Bureau of the USAID, US Agency for International Development. We then have Professor John Lim. He's the founding executive director at the Center for Regulatory Excellence Core, which is part of Duke National University of Singapore Medical College. We then have Dr. Felicity Jameson. She is the Director of Regulatory Strengthening and Support Section within the International Regulatory Branch at the Therapeutic Goods Administration, Australia. We have Major General Mohammad Mahbubur Rahman. He's the Major General and Medical Doctor in Drug Regulatory Authority of the Ministry of Health, Government of Bangladesh. We then have Mr. Narayan Prasad Dakal. He's the Director General of Nepal's Department of Drug Administration. So I welcome all the panelists again, and we will probably start with the drug regulatory authorities we have today. To give a little more context, several countries in the last couple of years, I would say, because the pandemic has been going on for years now, they have to deal with various aspects of regulations. And these start anywhere from deciding on which drug products are eligible for the populations they have in the countries, to how long these products can be used, understand evolving science, and also sometimes takes the decision of moving some of these emergency use authorized medicines to the full approval. Maybe we can start with Dr. Obaidullah from the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan to share his experience on how all these decisions were made and the challenges and opportunities they have while implementing this in Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koduri. And in fact, USP has taken lead in organizing this event. And responding to this question, in fact, if we see that COVID-19 has affected each and every aspect of life, and so is the regulatory sciences as well. And we also know that the usual development process for any drug takes 5 to 7 years, and also same time is required for the regulatory approval. But if we see in this pandemic that science moves faster than the regulatory processes, and they have developed something which requires public health urgency, and even science has developed some things, and at the same time regulatory processes has approved all these things. So it's very important to understand that previously, as shared by the Jude and Dr. Suli as well, and they have given the examples of Ebola and MERS and SARS as well. But if we realize that all these diseases were not pandemic in true sense, and they were restricted for some part of the globe. And after the emergence of this COVID-19, it was the first chance that the whole globe was encountered a very different scenario of disease, and pandemic was declared as well in the whole world. And keeping the in view scenario of this pandemic, every regulatory authority, in fact, has took some decisions, and after that, the concept of regulatory preparedness come. If we see that after these Ebola and SARS, emergency prepared was introduced even by the WHO for the public health sector as well. And if we see our global regulatory scenario, the concept of regulatory preparedness was introduced at that time, in probably it was 2017. And keeping in view all these things, COVID-19 approvals of all these emergency use authorizations was granted. In fact, if we see, it was not only the vaccine which was approved by various regulatory authority, and so we do as well. There were some medical devices as well, on the basis of which we also granted the this emergency use authorization. And if we see chronological events for these emergency use authorizations, in fact, remdesivir was the first drug which was granted emergency use authorization by the USAID and EMA and some other stringent regulatory authorities as well. And following the concept of reliance and recognition, Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan also followed this pathway, and we granted the emergency use authorization to the remdesivir on the basis of some abbreviated pathways of our regulation. Luckily, our legislation, which we introduced in 2012, previously it was the 1976 legislation, and in 2012, Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan legislation was approved by our parliament, and we got the concept of some type of emergency approvals as well. It is not truly emergency preparedness in the true sense which the Dr. Suli has shared and Gabriel has shared, but it gives the concept of emergency approvals and emergency authorization to some extent. And we took lead, and our approvals are that on the basis of some emergency and abbreviated pathways. So remdesivir was the first drug which we approved with the emergency use authorization. And at the same time, then there was a series of vaccines which we approved on the basis of this emergency use authorization, abbreviated pathways, adopting the concept of reliance, and also following the recognition concept, we granted some emergency use authorization to some of these vaccines. And in fact, it was not the question of granting the emergency use authorization for the vaccines. It was the question, and it was the discussion of the availability of these vaccines as well. So in fact, we, being regulatory authority, put our dialogues with our international health partners as well, including WHO and COVAX facilities as well, not only for the regulatory approvals, but also for the some sort of the availability of vaccines as well. And in fact, it was something that every health authority has made regulations somewhat flexible for expediting the approval of the drug availability. In this context, Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan held a series of meetings with the WHO HQ as well, because at that time there was not any vaccine which was not only because most of the vaccine was in the process of PQ, and we took part in the some sort of reviewing the process of reviewing the dossier of some of the vaccines as well. So in fact, all these things have been qualified and all these approvals were granted, keeping in view the risk analysis, risk benefit ratio to qualify for every drug to have the emergency use authorization. And the drugs and vaccines which have shown some positive benefit ratio, we granted some abbreviated clinical evaluation, and after that, all those drugs which qualify for the treatment of unmet medical needs that got the emergency use authorization. And these drugs include remdesivir. These are the vaccines: Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and similarly Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccine as well. And one thing very important which I want to share and highlight on the part of the TRAP Pakistan, that is, we conducted one phase 3 clinical trial, which was very large scale, about 15,000 individuals clinical in trial subjects, and we granted emergency use authorization to one of our vaccine, which was developed by CanSino Biologics China, and phase 3 clinical trial was conducted in Pakistan. It was a multi-center trial, and after this trial results, we also approved, we granted the emergency use authorization to this CanSino vaccine. And in fact, China Regulatory Authority, Mexico Regulatory Authority, they also took approval as the reliance and clinical trial conducted by us. They also granted some of the approval. And just to share with all our colleagues that this now clinical trial has been published in the elsewhere as well. So it was something which was very defining moments for our regulatory authority as well, that we granted something approval and emergency use authorization to a vaccine which was tested in Pakistan on indigenous basis. So it is a very good example of evidence-based decision making which we have taken in this COVID situation. Thank you. It's over from my side.
Dr. Obaidullah, these were some great points. I would circle back to you on some of it as the discussion progresses. I would want to request Major General Mahbubur Rahman, sir, to talk his experience of authorizations in Bangladesh.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. You know that the COVID pandemic, actually, when it started, we knew very little about this disease. That is regarding the virus and how we can prevent this virus. There are a lot of confusions, in fact, among the scientists and other sphere of the people in the different countries. But you know that when we started with this pandemic, three things was very, very important. One is your personal protective equipment, and then another is the medications for the disease, and another the vaccines. So first of your personal protective equipment, that is the mask, then your PPE coverall, and other than like gloves. So these in Bangladesh is in the beginning, actually we produce very little amount of this your PPE coverall and mask. Only few industries they could produce this source of commodities. And when it started that this pandemic started, then there was a lot of crisis, actually, this source of commodities in Bangladesh. Then actually there was improvisation in Bangladesh. We started giving NOC to our government's industries for manufacturing this PPE coverall and your mask. And we gave this authorization under NOC, that is no objection certificate. And we received this mandate from our Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And then they started this manufacturing of this mask and your PPE coverall. And you will be happy to know that in Bangladesh now, there are more than 35 industries who can produce and manufacture this mask. And also there are say more than 57 industries, those who are producing this your PPE coverall. And not only that, we are exporting this PPE cover and mask in different countries. And another experience was for Bangladesh that we did not have any provision of emergency use authorization in our regulation. So what we did, actually, we got some mandate from our Minister of Health and Family Welfare regarding the issuing of emergency use authorization of your vaccines, then your medicines, and other medical products like medical devices also. And under this mandate, we started giving emergencies authorization. Now we can mention some of the medicines or drugs like remdesivir, favipiravir, molnupiravir, then your nirmatrelvir and ritonavir, that is the Paxlovid in India, in the USA, when it was given emergency authorization by US FDA, then we also gave this emergency authorization of these drugs. And also we provided 6 vaccines emergency authorization in Bangladesh, which are being used in Bangladesh. And you know that we have already developed this emergency use authorization guideline in our country for your this vaccines, and also for your risk-based post-marketing guidelines for and a protocol for post-marketing surveillance of COVID-19 vaccine, and different types of guideline and protocol we have developed to give your emergency authorization and NOC in Bangladesh. So in short, in my opinion, that the local production capacity is very, very important. Not only local, regional capacity of producing that medicines, medicinal product, vaccines is very, very important. We have seen that there was a lot of crisis in the initial stage due to lack of this local production. So when Bangladesh became self-sufficient in those products like your PPE coverall, mask, and some of the medicines like remdesivir, then molnupiravir, favipiravir, we actually exported those products in our neighboring countries, and also in other countries like African countries and European countries. So this is very important that this local and regional capacity should be strengthened and enhanced. And another thing is that whatever we have done, it was actually reliance and recognition. It was in our policies and guidelines that we can accept the emergencies authorization or registration of some of the stringent regulatory authority, like we have 7 countries, and EMA is our stringent regulatory authority. We can just rely on them, and we can award registration or emergency authorization of any medicinal product. And on the basis of that reliance and recognition, we started giving this actually emergency authorization. And yet we have not given any registration of those products. It is under study. In course of time, maybe those products will be given emergency registration. And in this connection, I want to mention that research and development is very, very important to tackle or to combat future pandemic, if there is any. And another thing is that surveillance is also very important, because anything happens in any corner in the globe, within no time it travels to anywhere in the world. So together we should work together, and affordability and accessibility is also very important, because an equitable distribution of the your resources like your PPE, personal protective equipment, then your medicines, and also vaccines. This is also very important. So that was the experience from Bangladesh, and so far we can confidently say that we have tackled this pandemic very effectively. And in this connection, our USP PQM Plus and other organizations, WHO, they extended their help to us to successfully overcome those situations. Thank you very much.
Dr. Rahman, thank you so much for sharing your insights from Bangladesh. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So I would request the panelists to Try to stick to 2 minutes in sharing your perspectives. So we'll now move to Mr. Narayan Prasad Dakal and to share his experience from Nepal.
Yeah, thank you, Kaduri. I get 2 minutes, as you said, right? Am
Yes,
I
sir, please go
audible?
ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So good afternoon, everyone. Having heard about the experience of my colleague from Bangladesh and Pakistan, I think much of the situation was similar in Nepal also. But once, the COVID came into Nepal, that was in 2020 February. The first case came March, February. And we were there was situation like we didn't have much learning and much knowledge about the disease. And there was no, clear, therapeutics as predecessor presented during this discussion. That situation actually put us into some sort of confusing situation. What actually would be the best, type of products, maybe diagnostic, medicines, therapeutics, vaccines. We never know, which would be the best one. So that was the situation previously at that time. And once, things started evolving, like as my colleague said, the remdesivir, for example, that was first provided UA in the US and other countries. In Nepal also, a lot of clinicians and media started asking for these medicines to be allowed in the market. Then we actually didn't have any law to actually regulate or provide any pathway for investigational products to the public. That was a big what you call bottleneck, or that was a problem with Nepal situation. So we tried to really solve this problem through the ministry, and we fortunately got the ordinance, and we revised the current existing law, and then we provision the requirement of the authority to issue EUA for vaccines and therapeutics. But for other diagnostics and medical devices, actually wasn't under the purview of drug law, and we weren't actually regulating them. But for that also, the Ministry of Health tried to have some sort of committee involving experts in that area, and then that committee actually named as Health Technology Health Technology Assessment Committee. That was formed in the ministry. So we tried, these two pathways were developed. One is for drug and vaccines were provided through the Department of Drug Administration with that new ordinance. And we also prepared a rule to allow and giving the process of getting UA, and then allowing the UA. So that was actually developed, and that took some time. And during this period, some sort of infodemics, everybody talks about, that infodemics actually cause a lot of pressure under the regulatory to allow any sort of medicines. Like during that period, favipiravir was actually introduced in some of the neighboring countries, but we couldn't allow that because we didn't have any that pathway. And then we pursue for some sort of clinical study pathway. So it was put into that pathway, and then the patient were benefited, and they were put into the study group. So that was the situation during that period. After having this EUA according to the ordinance, we issued several EUA for 8 vaccines, particularly because we do not have any local manufacturing of vaccines. So we had to rely on extra imports. So that situation was actually making us to allow more and more EUA for vaccines. So we provided EUA for Covishield from India, which is AstraZeneca version of Serum Institute of Vaccine. We provided Sinopharm Varicella vaccine, Moderna, accordingly AstraZeneca, Janssen, and also Sinovac Varicella, Sputnik also, and the Comirnaty, that is Pfizer vaccine. So these were provided, EUA during this period. And then that ordinance was expired. The situation now we are facing, that ordinance expired, and we could not enact into the regular law. So that parliament was sitting, but Parliament could not actually discuss on this new ordinance. So that the situation currently we are facing, actually the similar situation pre-UA situation now. So we are already starting to really get that approved from the concerned authority. So this is the a little bit experience I just shared. So from this, what we learn, I just come to the second part of it. And during this period, we learned that we adopted reliance. For example, WHO UAL product were actually accepted as EUA product in Nepal also. We adopted that information. Accordingly, we also adopted stringent authority approved products. For example, FDA approved or EMA approved products were also eligible for EUA in the country. So that was a reliance concept we adopted here in Nepal. And similarly, we also try to really review, develop certain guidelines so that the applicant can actually apply and can provide sufficient document for getting this approved. So that was the second part of it. So what I actually would like to share in this situation is that we need to really completely agree with the presentation that we should have some sort of reliance concept in terms of pandemics, because we don't know the pandemics and what type of disease, pattern, how it will evolve during the course of time. So we should have something, what do you call that, reliance, and that was discussed earlier. So we have to adopt that, or recognition, mutual recognition agreements, that may be through the, US, that may be through the WHO or UN agencies initiated initiative, so that we can actually, every country can adopt that type of, come into that type of mutual agreement. So that may be a good solution for many countries like us, because during this pandemic, the supply chain disruption occurs, and we cannot actually procure medicine or therapeutics. If even we have a pathway for UA, that becomes a big problem for many countries which are actually importing countries. So we should have some reliance concept, and then I fully agree that we should have a stockpiling context. We need to have a stockpiling policies of the government as well as regional governments to working to solve the pandemic's situation. So that was the second point I just wanted to highlight here.
So
I
thank
think,
you so much, Mr. Galan. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the next speakers. So, the regulator clearly highlighted a lot of challenges for various categories of products, but also various functions across the emergency use authorization process. We also have a lot of experts from developmental partners who've been working regionally with many regulators hand in hand. So probably we'll move on to Dr. Jameson to share her experience in the Asia Pacific region.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I was actually going to share my experience as a regulator for the TGA. So the TGA, and I will keep it quick, we don't actually have an emergency use authorization pathway. So we utilized our provisional registration pathway, which is a lot like the European conditional approval pathway, which was described in the presentation. So I won't elaborate on it. But we've utilized this to approve 4 vaccines and 5 COVID therapies. And maybe just quickly some key features of the pathway. Provisional products can be registered provisionally for a maximum of 6 years, and it involves enhanced post-market monitoring, such as risk management plans, a black triangle scheme, and a pharmacovigilance inspection program. We also perform batch release testing on provisionally registered products. One of the key elements I think that's been really a lesson learned from COVID is to have really good communication, both with the applicant and international partner organisations such as the WHO, but also other regulators. For all provisional products, we strongly encourage the submission of evaluation reports from other regulators. So we actually have reliance built into our requirements. For this to really be successful, however, we need access to full unredacted reports because we need certainty around the manufacturing sites, the formulations, and so we can connect that to the clinical trials. In order to approve the COVID products, the vaccines and the treatments quickly, we put multidisciplinary teams on the task, and they were dedicated just on the COVID products. We also had to change our legislation. So for the Provisional Pathway, there were 4 criteria that it had to be an application for either a new medicine or a new indication. It had to treat a serious condition, and that you needed to have a clinical study plan. There were 2 other criteria which were removed for COVID treatments and vaccines, and they were you needed to be provide evidence that how you compared against existing therapeutic goods, and that you needed to demonstrate that you're a major therapeutic advance. We actually changed our legislation in July last year to remove those for COVID products so that we could be more agile and have more flexibility. In the work I have been doing with the aid programs, we have provided assistance to other regulators in the region in terms of their issuing emergency use authorizations for COVID vaccines. And I guess I'll just end with one key reflection on that, which is that you can share a lot of regulatory documents, but really nothing has been more, I think, productive than when you can have evaluator to evaluator conversations and really get into the nitty-gritty and make sure that everybody understands the data that we're all looking at together. And that's where I've seen Reliance work most effectively. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jameson, for highlighting all the systems that needs to be in place for facilitating those authorizations. So, Dr. Fryer, if you can talk about your experience from USAID.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Well, USAID is not a regulatory agency, as you know, but we have been supporting the work of PQM Plus and other projects from the agency's perspective. I can just briefly reflect on what we have learned. Clearly, the story is still being written. I mean, we don't know everything about this pandemic and about the responses. There has been clearly good description of the shortcomings of some of the regulatory agencies. By the way, we were talking a little bit earlier about the pandemic response and pandemic preparedness plans, and I'm not sure, having reviewed many of these plans, that sufficient space was given to the regulatory side. That said, I think that the most NMRAs have demonstrated a remarkable agility to tackle this pandemic. I think that there has been technical difficulties, especially with regard to information sharing, access to information, and that sort of things. But in general, I think that the regulatory agencies, with the support of the governments, of course, have been performing rather well. And the case of EUAs, for example, is clear that EUAs have saved lives. There is no question about that. I think, you know, crises provide opportunities. The regulatory agencies, I mean, generally remain the shadow. You only hear about them when there is a failure of the system. Here, I think that this pandemic in particular provides chances to bring them into the spotlight and make the adjustment that are necessary to address future needs, future pandemics. And I'm not just talking about EUA or the COVID-19 response, but it's very clear, and that the regional approach, and I'm saying that not just because I'm from a regional bureau of USAID, but it's very clear that the regional cooperation is something that can accelerate all the process. So we have gained in terms of economies of scale and timeliness, but also probably in terms of costs, which is not sufficiently discussed, but I think it's a critical element of the regional cooperation. At USAID, we have engaged into collaboration through CEARN, that is, hosted by WHO, and ASEAN, as well as with APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, through the Pharmaceutical Product Working Group at ASEAN, and APEC through the another committee that works on regulation. So we are firmly committed to continue our support at country level, and that means providing technical assistance, which is what PQM Plus does, but also trying to institutionalize the capacity of the NMRAs and reinforce their local capacity. But that has to be, and that does not exclude a strong effort to foster regional cooperation in terms of, for example, data sharing, or having joint clinical trial and that sort of thing, or post-marketing surveillance. So this is what I wanted to say briefly, is that we don't know everything. We've learned a lot. We are, as an agency, committed to continuous support of the NMRAs at country level, but also at regional level. So that's it. Over to you.
Thank you for sharing those additional aspects that we have to focus, JJ. Can I just request Dr. Colin to share his perspectives from ADB?
Thank you very much. So I guess for us, we have intrinsic support for all the regulation process. We consider this governance mechanism globally to be an essential part of health services. One which, as I think Jean-Jacques has said, is probably been slightly overlooked in previous health investments. It's always been part of governance, a building block for health systems, but probably in small print rather than big, bold, large print that we're now seeing. I don't think it's the major reason, problems with regulation in terms of vaccine inequity around the world, but it's certainly been a bottleneck for us in being able to disperse our finances. So we have a $9 billion fund at ADB to procure vaccines for our developing member states. And the requirements rest really on regulatory requirements. So we can only purchase vaccines that have been listed by COVAX, that have a WHO EUL, or have been approved by one of the, I think it's 6 SRAs that WHO has designated as being able to vet the quality, safety, and effectiveness of COVID vaccines. So in that respect, we're quite limited in terms of the regulatory approvals if WHO doesn't issue a timely EUL. Many of the vaccines are not being targeted to stringent regulatory authorities' markets. They're going to developing member states. And so that means that the EUA process across the board is not acceptable to us for procuring vaccines. So that's created a little bit of a delay in us being able to, we set the bar high in terms of regulatory standards, but it means we cannot quickly disperse money. So I think, we look at that and try and recognize what are these things that we can streamline in the short and longer terms. So how do we improve the maturity level of regulators? How do we improve the dialogue between regulators and between manufacturers and regulators? And to that end, we formed a regional vaccine advisory group, of which TGA is the current chair, where we try and share information rapidly and try and resolve regulatory hurdles as quick as we can so that we can purchase vaccines and get them to people as quick as possible. I guess also we're conscious of, that the process has to be respected. There has been a backlash in some countries around this concept that the process has been rushed, that vaccines are not safe, that vaccines don't work. So we're conscious of adhering to a process that has scientific rigor, and we can be sure of the quality of vaccines that are coming out the other end. I guess our other thoughts sort of moving forward is that we're trying to build regulation into other investments. So when we talk about pharmacovigilance and looking for adverse event surveillance, which could be a standalone surveillance activity, we're trying to build in the regulatory components of that. When manufacturing is talked about to boost the capacity of countries or build new capabilities, we're talking about the whole ecosystem, that it has to come with training people and tying that directly to regulators and not just leaving it as a standalone facility, that the entire ecosystem needs to be built for functional systems. And we're also looking at the academic and clinical links there, so that the education of people, including policymakers, can come along to recognise the importance of investments in regulation, the importance of understanding longer term manufacturing capability and how countries can sustain that. And I guess that also recognising that regional collaborative approach is absolutely integral to solving these problems and building health security. I think it's been mentioned by the Independent Pandemic Panel on pandemics and preparedness. We're also looking at it in terms of some of the regional entities. The new ASEAN Centre for Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Diseases could be one conduit to building coherence and mutual recognition. So thanks, I'll stop there because I think we're running out of time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben. Transparency in communication and the process has been key, and I think it's one of those important points under the whole emergency use authorization. I want Professor Lim to comment on what his observations have been on how transparency has been diversely handled across the globe, and what lessons do we have to, importantly learn on that. Professor Lim.
Thank you, Dr. Kaduri, and the invitation to share thoughts with this panel. Yes, the issue you raise is an extremely important one. And of course, in the ideal situation, there should be maximum public transparency, even if you're talking in an emergency use authorization setting. But there have been many challenges to make this happen in the course of the pandemic. And they have largely been the result of points that the previous panelists have mentioned. And they link really to capacity building of NMRAs. And I'm speaking here as the former head of the Singapore NMRA, and realizing how difficult this is in this kind of situation where not only the public, but the political leaders, as well as other neighbors in the region, are looking at decisions that may be made. And without that capacity building and the technical ability to manage the data and the information, even though I would say the amount of data sharing has been highly commendable in the course of this pandemic, if not for the fact that there had been many steps in the past decade for sharing of information, I think we would have been in a much worse situation. And of course, USP and other organizations like WHO and the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities have played a significant role to make that data available. But one thing we've realized, and even in my center at UCAN US, is when we took the WHO good reliance practice guidances that were issued in April last year in 2021, it's not the principle of reliance to make those decisions and then be transparent about it is widely accepted now, a lot more than it was 10 or 20 years ago. But we have realized that because of some of the situations that the regulators mentioned earlier, it has not been so straightforward to apply reliance in a normal situation, let alone in an emergency setting using emergency use authorization pathways. And so this aspect that has been mentioned several times already of capacity building, of training, of technical competence is extremely important to strengthen NMRAs to be able to be transparent, especially when there's a lot of pushback in terms of negative information or false information, which is not scientifically based. And then this links to a second critical point, which is that NMRAs, and we have realized this in a very significant way in the course of the last 2 years, do not function in isolation. And previously, we've always been talking about building the capacity of NMRAs as though they exist in a vacuum. But as you've heard from previous panelists, this is not the case. NMRAs have had to deal with governments. They've had to deal with the fact that other parties within nations have already procured vaccines and products before they've even had access to the data. And so there is a very important point if we talk about transparency, whether now or going forward, to ensure that as we think of capacity building, it's also to ensure that NMRAs are able to deal with other stakeholders within national boundaries, but across the region. And in APEC, there was an attempt made even pre-COVID to try and promote communication between regulators, health ministries, and even finance ministries. Because if you just look at NMRAs in terms of the training specifically, NMRAs are not, they're very technical scientific people, which is the strength of it. But they need then to be able to convey this information to decision makers, and then to be able to convey the information to the public when you are dealing with the fact that people are concerned that decisions are being made based on insufficient data. And so that's another skill set that has to be developed. And I think really in conclusion, it comes back to this important point of communication collaboration. There has to be regional and international communication collaboration amongst regulators for rapid sharing of information to make emergency use authorizations viable. And secondly, there must be communication and collaboration amongst international, regional, and national stakeholders. These include dealing with government, with finance ministries, with other stakeholders within government, but then also with manufacturers and procurers of information, of products. And I would say even when there are aid agencies, there has to be that communication. So Dr. Kuduri, I will stop there because I think that's a very critical point, that we have to realize these issues, the lessons learned, and then really bring this together to strengthen the systems, not just for NMRAs, but basically health systems to deal with future pandemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lim. And I think those were some great points. And in the interest of time, I want to quickly, very briefly summarize the whole conversation. There was a lot of conversation in setting up the regulation, and I'm happy during this pandemic, we would have set up a lot of confusions and clarities around regulation. But a lot of you also pointed out to a risk-based approach with a lot of international collaboration. There will continue to be challenges on new products and understanding them and approve them. And that's where a lot of reliance is going to focus on. But all of this has to be transparently communicated to everybody to give confidence. I want to quickly move to give an opportunity to my colleague Mahmood Anwar to give a closing remarks, but I want to heartfully thank all speakers for doing a great job in sharing your quick insights. Mahmood?
Thanks, Chaitanya. So it's, first of all, I would like to thank everyone who took their time out for this session today. My special thanks to all the presenters, moderators, and panelists. And there are some of our colleagues that who actually made themselves available today on our immediate request. I would like to take a few names here. Dr. Bonzu, Director General FDD Lao, Mr. C and Mrs. Che, Deputy Director General DDF Cambodia, Dr. Adrian, Regional Advisor WHO, who were among the participants, and they were present during the whole discussion, and they actually took time out today and just made themselves available for this session. Emergency authorization of drug approval is a very relevant topic in current environment. And this topic is extremely important in the region, because most of the countries in the region are from middle-income countries or developing countries, and the limitation of human and scientific resources in these countries actually pose them to a lot of challenges when it comes to emergency use authorization for vaccines or other medicine. We had an excellent discussion. I will just quickly reflect upon a few points, which emerged out of this discussion today. One very important point, first and foremost, is there is definitely a need of strong coordination and information exchange mechanism among all the stakeholders, whether those stakeholders are national medicine regulatory authorities or other stakeholders like donors or development sector partners. So there should be they can facilitate this process and help to tackle the future pandemic. Principles of reliance and recognition also emerged out as a very key point during this discussion today. That also it was highlighted by almost every panelist. Then we also heard national medicine regulatory authorities talking about importance of availability of policies and regulations, that how they played a role in early days and during tackling this pandemic and approving and making multiple therapeutics and vaccines available in the country. So and then not last not the least, that there is definitely need to prepare national medicine regulatory authorities in order to tackle future pandemics. And as John mentioned, that with the help of partners, whether from the donor side community and also from other stakeholders, there will be definitely an emphasis in the future. I'm getting a message from Tanya that there are 2 questions, so I will just stop here before saying my final thank you to everyone. I will those 2 questions. Chaitanya, do you want to take over those questions and then ask send it to the respective panelists, please?
Yeah, so I can see one question in the question answer session, but in the interest of time, I think it's partly answered. So I would encourage, taking help from speakers to send a long answer, then to move beyond time.
Great, thank you, Chaitanya. So once again, so it's like we will be sending the answer of this question later through the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So, so finally, I would say thank you very much, everyone, all my colleagues who are from PQM Plus side, from USP side, who actually helped to put together this session. Also grateful to all the panelists for taking time out from their busy schedule. Regulatory authorities, my fellow participants, colleagues from different organizations. Thank you all for being here today and taking the time to patiently listen to the wonderful presentation and discussion. I wish you all a blessed day and a very happy New Year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.